Why is it unhealthy? Again, remember that. So look at where that epicardial fat is. You have epicardial fat surrounding your coronary vessels. So, yep, this. So the interesting thing is like this fat is present pretty much in everyone. And it was very interesting though. There was like maybe 1 or 2 years ago or out. So there was somebody who donated their body to the medical school and they had a very lean heart, but most people typically have a bit of fat. I mean, it depends on the person. The cool thing about heart anatomy is like not everyone's heart looks like this. They have the same general structure, but there might be slight variances depending on your lifestyle and other diet and other factors as well. So yeah, you would see typically more of this epicardial fat in obese individuals, but again, it depends on the person. But what I'm getting at here, yeah, you have this epicardial fat that can affect the surrounding tissues. Now what we have here are the coronary vessels. And now I'm only going to talk about the coronary arteries. So remember, arteries are carrying blood away from the heart. But this is where the coronary arteries are interesting. They're carrying it away from the inside of the heart towards the walls of the heart and tissues of the heart. So the coronary circulation is your heart's own blood supply. So even though your heart pumps blood, it also has all these metabolically active cells. It has a lot of these muscle cells. Therefore, these muscle cells need energy. And how do they get that? They get that energy, oxygen, and nutrients from their coronary artery blood supplies. So here are the major coronary arteries we see in here. So what I want to go over is like, yeah, the heart is metabolically active. It needs all the blood. It needs a lot of blood and nutrients and oxygen. So there are two main branches: the right and left coronary artery. The right coronary artery also branches into something called the posterior descending artery, also abbreviated PDA, sometimes called posterior interventricular artery. I think it's worth it. I mean, it depends on the textbook, depends on the institution, that some people refer like PDA more than posterior interventricular. I think it's worth your while to know both because again, depends on what hospital you end up at. And then the other branch, again, left, you have the right coronary artery, you have the left coronary artery, and this is one big one. So this is called often I call it the LED all the time, the left anterior descending artery. And I love that one. Why? Because it tells you exactly which way it goes. It goes left, it goes anterior, and it descends. That pretty much tells you the path. Also called the LAD artery, sometimes also called the anterior interventricular artery. And then you have the circumflex artery. So whenever you have some sort of vessel that's called circumflex, that means it wraps around something. So think like circumference is the outer perimeter of a circle. So something is like a circumflex vessel typically is like a circle, right? It wraps around something, so flexes around and something. So that's what the circumflex does. And so why do you need these coronary arteries? Well, again, you know you have all this blood inside your heart, but how would you say your heart was only dependent on the blood inside of your heart? And as we get to the vessels later on, you'll find out like this is an efficient way to actually supply blood to your heart because you're constantly pumping the blood throughout your heart chambers. But if we only have blood here, how would you get the blood from here to the other layers? So we know the endocardium is exposed to blood all the time. So this is why you need those coronary arteries and their branches. The coronary arteries run along the epicardium, but they also branch into throughout the surface of the epicardium, the myocardium and endocardium, to help distribute the blood more across the heart wall. So it's not dependent on this inefficient transfer on the inside of the heart. So this is how you're able to supply your entire heart wall with blood, is through the coronary arteries. The pericardium has its own separate blood supply via a branch of the internal thoracic and the phrenocardial artery, but this is the coronary arteries, very important for those layers of your heart wall. Now, so the interesting thing about the blood flow, okay, the left ventricle squeezes, you have blood going up through your aorta. So the cool thing is that can the blood leak from the endocardium to the inside of the heart valves? Inside of the heart valves. I'm not quite sure what that means. Yeah, so the inside of the chambers? I mean, says you have exposure of the endocardium to the blood. I'm not sure what that means, but yeah, let's get. It's a kind of tight lecture, so we'll continue on this. So the interesting thing is that you have heart. I mean, it's like you always have blood to some extent in your aorta, but what prevents the aorta from back flushing? You have that valve. So the interesting thing is that the valve not only prevents that regurgitation from the aorta to the left ventricle, the cool thing is that what do you have on the left and right of the aortic valve? You have the coronary arteries. So you have the left and right branches. It's not coincidental. So if you do have pressure going this way, it's going to shut the valve, but not only shut the valve, this blood is going to shunt into the left and right coronary artery. So this is a cool mechanism of how your heart is able to pump blood to the coronary vessels. So it goes to the left and right branches. So again, the left coronary artery, the two major branches are the LAD, going again left, anterior, and descending. I love that. It actually is some systematic, makes sense. And then you have the circumflex artery. So the circumflex artery doesn't stop there. It actually wraps around toward the posterior of the heart. And then you also have the right coronary artery, and then you also have the right marginal artery. Yeah, so I think I added that this year. Maybe you should know the marginal arteries because, again, yeah, there's a left and right marginal artery. So now we're looking from the anterior to the posterior. Now we're looking at the back of the heart. So that circumflex artery, again, is going to start off with the left branch, and then it started off at the anterior. Now it wraps around toward the posterior. So that's why it's called the circumflex. And you also have a left marginal artery that branches off from that. Now the right coronary artery continues. You have the marginal artery, but then you have this other major branch of the right coronary artery called the PDA, the posterior descending artery or posterior interventricular artery. So you should definitely know the bolded ones I highlighted there. Know all of those major coronary arteries. Now, coronary arteries, again, yeah, so you have your left, and then the branches, LAD, circumflex, and then you have the right, and that branches off into the PDA. So definitely know those four at a minimum. Now, if you have arteries, you need veins. You need something to drain the cardiac tissue and collect all the deoxygenated and nutrient poor and all the waste from the blood. So you have four major veins I want you to know: the great, small, middle, and posterior cardiac veins. And they all drain into this big vessel called the coronary sinus, which eventually drains into, well, let's see, do we have time? Okay, well, I'll get there when we get there. Okay, so what we have here is a great cardiac vein. So this is another way to think of it. Like the LAD, I'll keep on emphasizing LAD is so important. So the great cardiac vein also runs parallel to the LAD and also the circumflex here. And then we have the small cardiac vein going over here, draining this side. And you also have these small branches. So these anterior cardiac veins, they vary in location and number. Just know they're anterior, and you do have cardiac veins that help support and drain this side of the heart. Now what we have here, so the small cardiac vein kind of like boomerangs from the front anterior to the back posterior. And then the great cardiac vein also does that as well. So then the posterior cardiac vein fuses with the great cardiac vein at the coronary sinus. And you also have the middle cardiac vein over here joining the small cardiac vein. Now notice that all four of these vessels, they lead to the same chamber. So this is what we call the coronary sinus. And where do you think the coronary sinus leads to? Or what chamber of the heart do you think this is? So hint, these are veins, and they're carrying deoxygenated blood. This blood is also nutrient poor and also has waste products. So yeah. Ooh, good question. In dissection, how can you tell arteries from veins? They're hard to tell. They're not going to be this nice red and blue. But things in like general diameter and also the consistency of the walls of the vessels, you can kind of tell an artery from a vein. But that's the thing; it's very easy to confuse. Luckily, a lot of these, yeah. Or which chamber of the heart? So you have 4 chambers, right, left, and right, atria and ventricles. Yeah, so that would drain into the right atrium.